Imagine owning a home that's been in your family for over 150 years, only to wake up one day and find a letter saying you don't own it anymore. That's exactly what happened when a homeowners association slapped a black man with thousands of dollars in fake fines, hoping to steal his historic property. But what they didn't expect was that this man wasn't about to back down. And the fight that followed shook the entire neighborhood. Reginald Carter had lived a life of quiet dignity. To the world, he was a simple man, a retired mechanic known for his weathered hands, his slow smile, and the way he waved at every neighbor who passed his porch. But to his family, he was more than that. He was the guardian of a story that had begun more than 150 years ago, inside a house that stood like a monument to history. The Carter family home was not just bricks, beams, and old wood. It was a time capsule. Built in the years after the Civil War, it was one of the few properties in the region that a black family had been able to claim as their own in those hard years of Reconstruction. Reginald's great-great-grandfather, a freedman with calloused hands and a dream of independence, had laid its foundation. Every generation after him fought to keep it, through poverty, through racism, through economic storms that could have swept it away. Inside those walls lived laughter and sorrow, victories and losses. The worn-out staircase still creaked where children once raced down on Christmas mornings. The kitchen, though small, had hosted countless Sunday dinners where stories were passed like sacred scripture. And outside, under the broad shade of the magnolia tree, elders had told children about the struggles that came with being black landowners in America, how hard it was to gain property, and how much harder it was to keep it when powerful hands tried to take it away. For Reginald, this house wasn't wealthy. It wasn't a luxury. It was blood and sacrifice, a place soaked with the sweat of generations. It represented survival against all odds, dignity when society tried to strip it away, and pride in a legacy money could never buy. But legacies are fragile things. What took generations to build can be undone by greed in a matter of weeks. And in the quiet halls of the neighborhood's homeowners association, the HOA, whispers began to rise. The house was old. The land it stood on was valuable. Developers had their eyes on it, and some saw the Carter property as an easy target. One afternoon, as Reginald sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, he noticed an envelope tucked into his mailbox. At first, he thought it was another community newsletter, the kind that announced lawn competitions and neighborhood watch updates. But when he opened it, his heart froze. The letter claimed he owed thousands of dollars in unpaid HOA fines. It accused him of failing to keep his lawn to standard, of letting paint chips on the shutters, even of parking his old truck in front of his house too often. Each so-called violation carried a fee, and the total balance was shocking. At the bottom of the letter, stamped in bold ink, was a chilling line. Failure to pay these fines may result in a lien placed on your property. Reginald's hands shook. He had never ignored his duties, never neglected his home. These charges were lies, but the threat was real. The house his family had protected for 150 years was suddenly in the crosshairs of powerful neighbors who wanted it gone. What Reginald didn't know yet was that this letter was only the beginning, and that his fight to save his home would expose a truth far larger than one man's struggle. The letter didn't just sit on Reginald's kitchen table. It haunted him. Every time he walked past it, the bold black lettering seemed to glare back, a silent threat: pay up or lose everything. At first, he thought it was a mistake. After all, he had lived in the neighborhood for decades without issue. He had paid his modest HOA fees on time, maintained his yard as best he could, and even helped neighbors when their cars broke down or their roofs leaked. Surely this had to be an accounting error. So he picked up the phone and called the HOA office. "Good morning, this is Carter, Reginald Carter," he began politely. "I think there's been a mistake. I just received a letter about fines." A cold, clipped voice cut him off. "There's no mistake, Mr. Carter. Your account is past due. If you don't want the fines to increase, I suggest you pay them immediately." Reginald tried to explain that he had never been warned of any violations, that no inspector had ever come to his home, that the claims about peeling paint and tall grass were flat-out lies. But the woman on the other end repeated the same line like a machine. Failure to comply will result in legal action. Then the call ended. That was when he realized this wasn't a clerical error. This was a setup. In the weeks that followed, more letters arrived. Each one stacked new charges on top of the old ones. Failure to remove debris, non-compliant vehicle parked on property, fence not painted within HOA guidelines. Some of the claims were absurd. Reginald didn't even own a fence. Yet the fines kept growing, climbing into the tens of thousands. Neighbors began to whisper. Some looked at him with pity, others avoided eye contact altogether. A few even suggested he should just let it go and sell the house before things got worse. That stung. These were people who had eaten at his table, borrowed his tools, and waved to him for years. Now, their silence felt like betrayal. Behind closed doors, the HOA's president, a sharp-eyed woman named Linda, was meeting with real estate developers. They saw Reginald's house not as a legacy, but as prime land for luxury condos. The HOA's plan was simple. Bury him in so many fake fines that he could never pay, then slap a lien on the property, force a foreclosure, and sell it to the highest bidder. To them, it was business. To Reginald, it was the theft of his soul. One evening, as he sat on the porch staring at the house his ancestors had built, he felt the weight of their presence. He imagined his great-great-grandfather's hands in the foundation, his grandmother's prayers in the walls. He whispered to himself, I will not be the one to lose it. Not after all they went through. But the HOA wasn't finished. The next letter wasn't just a warning. It was a notice of lien. In black and white, it declared that his home was no longer free and clear. It was now collateral for a debt he didn't even owe. The trap had been sprung. And while the HOA thought they had him cornered, they had underestimated one thing. A man fighting for his family's legacy doesn't back down. He rises. For days after the lien notice arrived, Reginald barely slept. He sat at the kitchen table surrounded by piles of letters, his heart heavy with fear. Every piece of paper screamed the same thing. You're about to lose everything. He thought of giving in. Selling the house might stop the bleeding, end the harassment, and silence the HOA. But every time that thought crept in, he'd glance at the faded family photos on the wall. His mother's wedding picture, his grandfather in his military uniform, children playing on that very porch generations earlier. To sell the house wasn't just to walk away from property. It was to betray every sacrifice that had kept it standing. One night, his daughter Angela found him hunched over those letters. She was in her 30s, a lawyer in training, sharp-eyed and full of fire. Daddy, she said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder, this isn't the end. This is the beginning. He looked up, weary. Angela, they've already put a lien on it. They've got the money. The lawyers. I can't fight them. But Angela leaned closer. Yes, you can. And you won't fight alone. They're counting on you being scared. They're counting on silence. But once this story gets out, it's not just about one man's house. It's about every family who's ever been bullied by greed. If we shine a light on this, they won't stand a chance. Her words struck him like a match to dry wood. For the first time in weeks, he felt a spark of hope. The next morning, Angela began gathering evidence. She photographed the so-called violations, the freshly painted shutters, the neatly trimmed lawn, the empty driveway. She pulled HOA bylaws, documenting every place where the board had overstepped. She even discovered that many of the votes for fines had been pushed through in secret meetings, without proper approval. Then they took the fight public. Angela reached out to a local news station, and within days, a reporter was standing on their porch with a camera crew. Reginald, nervous but determined, told his story on air. He spoke not with anger, but with quiet dignity. They want my home, he said, his voice steady. But this isn't just wood and nails. This house is my family's history, and I'll fight to keep it, not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong in their own neighborhood. The story spread like wildfire. Within a week it was being shared on social media, sparking outrage. Neighbors who had once avoided him now stopped by with words of encouragement. Some even admitted they too had been harassed by the HOA. though they had been too afraid to speak. Suddenly, Reginald was no longer alone. What the HOA thought would be a quiet foreclosure had turned into a public scandal. The board members, once smug in their meetings, now avoided the cameras that lingered outside the HOA office, and Linda, the president who had signed every letter, felt the pressure closing in. But she wasn't about to surrender. If Reginald wanted a fight, she was prepared to give him one. What she didn't realize was that she was no longer facing just one man. She was facing a movement. The HOA had made one critical mistake. They underestimated how far Reginald and Angela were willing to go. For weeks, the board continued piling on fines, hoping the pressure would break him. But instead of folding, the Carters prepared for war. Angela filed a lawsuit, challenging the legitimacy of the lien. She worked late into the night, surrounded by stacks of HOA bylaws, state housing statutes, and property records dating back to the 1800s. The more she uncovered, the clearer it became. The HOA had not only bent the rules, they had shattered them. When the day of the hearing arrived, the courthouse buzzed with curiosity. Word of the Carter case had spread far beyond the neighborhood. Civil rights advocates, local journalists, and even families from other towns came to watch. Many saw this not just as one man's fight, but as a battle against corruption that could set a precedent for countless others. Inside the courtroom, Linda, the HOA president, sat stiffly in a tailored suit. Her lawyers, 3 of them, flipped through their binders with smug confidence. To them, Reginald was just another homeowner who had fallen behind on payments. Easy to steamroll, easy to dismiss. But then Angela stood up. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and commanding, "the HOA claims my father owes thousands in fines. Yet not a single one of those fines is supported by evidence. They've accused him of violations that do not exist, and they've used those lies as a weapon to steal his property. This isn't enforcement of rules. This is fraud." Gasps rippled through the courtroom as she laid out the proof. Photographs showing the supposed violations were fabricated. Minutes from HOA meetings that violated their own bylaws, and financial records hinting at backroom deals between board members and developers. Each piece of evidence was a nail in the coffin of the HOA's credibility. Reginald sat silently at the plaintiff's table, but his presence spoke louder than words. His worn hands, folded on the desk, told the story of a man who had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to be robbed in the twilight of his life. When Linda's turn came, her lawyers argued that the HOA had full authority to enforce fines. They tried to paint Reginald as negligent, stubborn, unwilling to follow the rules everyone else respected. But their case crumbled under Angela's cross-examination. "So you fined him for a broken fence?" she asked, her eyebrow raised. "Yes," one lawyer replied. "And you're aware that Mr. Carter doesn't even have a fence?" Laughter broke out in the courtroom, quickly hushed by the judge. But the damage was done. By the time closing arguments ended, it was clear the tide had turned. The judge looked down at the HOA's legal team, his voice stern. Homeowners associations exist to protect communities, not to destroy them. "What I see here is a gross abuse of power." Reginald's heart pounded as the gavel struck. The lien was declared invalid. The fines were voided, and the HOA was ordered to pay damages for their fraudulent actions. Cheers erupted in the gallery. Neighbors hugged Reginald, some with tears in their eyes. For the first time in months, he felt the crushing weight lift from his shoulders. But the fight wasn't over yet. Because while the courtroom had given him justice, the HOA's corruption ran deeper than one case. And the world was just beginning to notice. The courthouse doors opened, and Reginald stepped out into the sunlight, clutching Angela's hand. Reporters immediately swarmed him, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. He had never seen so much attention in his life. But this was bigger than him. "Mr. Carter," one reporter shouted, "what does this victory mean to you?" Reginald paused, his voice steady but emotional. "It means my ancestors' fight wasn't in vain. They worked so hard to give us something of our own. And I wasn't going to let anyone take that away." Those words hit home. Within hours, the story spread across news channels, blogs, and social media. The headline blazed everywhere: HOA tried to steal historic black family home. Judge rules against them. People were outraged. Emails and phone calls flooded the county offices. Advocacy groups demanded investigations into not only this HOA, but into how many others were abusing their power across the country. Hashtags trended. Strangers sent messages of support, calling Reginald a symbol of resistance. Meanwhile, things began unraveling for Linda and her HOA board. Members of the community, once silent out of fear, now found their voices. Longtime residents stepped forward with their own stories of being bullied by the board. A single mother revealed she'd been fined for having a stroller left on her porch. Another man claimed he was harassed for parking his work truck in his driveway. Piece by piece, the facade of authority crumbled. What had once looked like order and discipline now looked like greed and discrimination. Developers who had been waiting to snatch up Reginald's land suddenly backed away, worried about being tied to a scandal. The board's reputation sank so low that even their allies distanced themselves. And yet, through all the chaos, Reginald remained humble. When neighbors thanked him for standing up, he simply shook his head. "I didn't do this just for me," he said. "I did it for all of us. If they could come for me, they could come for anyone." Angela, too, became a local hero. Invitations poured in from community groups and universities, asking her to speak about housing rights and legal protections. She turned every platform into a lesson about resilience, justice, and the importance of knowing your rights, but not everyone was celebrating. Behind closed doors, Linda seethed. Her once unshakable control had been shattered, and whispers of criminal charges loomed over her. Financial mismanagement, falsified records, and abuse of power were all under investigation. The very empire she had built to enrich herself was collapsing. And the person she had tried to crush was now the reason. For Reginald, the victory was about more than saving his home. It was about reclaiming dignity, about showing that even an ordinary man could stand up to corruption and win. As he sat on his porch that evening, looking out at the magnolia tree under a golden sunset, he felt a quiet strength. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. What had started as one family's fight was quickly turning into a movement. And movements have the power to change history. Weeks after the courtroom victory, life around Reginald's house began to feel different. The magnolia tree still swayed gently in the wind. The porch still creaked beneath his feet. But there was something new in the air, hope. Neighbors who once kept their heads down now stopped by to talk, to share, to thank him. They no longer saw his home as just an old house, but as a fortress of resilience, a place where justice had taken root. Children played in his yard again, and parents whispered to them, "Remember this house. Remember what it stands for." Angela often sat beside her father on the porch, stacks of letters in her lap. They came from all across the country, families who had watched the story unfold and felt inspired to fight back against their own injustices. Some had been harassed by their HOAs, others by landlords or corporations. But Reginald's stand had given them courage. One letter, written in shaky handwriting, stood out. It was from an elderly woman in Georgia who wrote, "I thought I was too old to keep fighting. But when I saw you, Mr. Carter, I realized it's never too late to protect what matters." Reginald held the letter to his chest, his eyes glistening with tears. The Carter home had survived threats, lies and greed, but now it was stronger than ever. And so was the man who protected it. Meanwhile, the fallout for the HOA was devastating. Linda was forced to resign in disgrace, facing multiple lawsuits and investigations. The very system she tried to weaponize became the chain that dragged her down. To the public, she became a cautionary tale, proof that no position of power is above accountability. But Reginald never gloated. He didn't need to. His victory was measured not in Linda's downfall, but in the legacy he had preserved. As the months passed, the Carter home became more than just a residence. It became a landmark. Community groups began hosting meetings there. Local schools invited students to visit, teaching them about perseverance and the importance of standing up for what's right. Journalists wrote follow-ups, calling it the house that justice saved. And through it all, Reginald remained the same humble man he had always been, tending his garden, waving to passers-by, telling stories about the ancestors who had built the home with their bare hands. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, Angela turned to her father. "You know, Daddy," she said softly, "this house isn't just ours anymore. It belongs to everyone who believes in justice." Reginald smiled, his voice low but firm. "That's exactly the way it should be." The magnolia tree rustled gently, as if in agreement, and so the Carter home stood tall, not just as wood and stone, but as a monument to courage, family, and the unbreakable will of a man who refused to be erased. A story that began with greed and corruption ended with something far more powerful: inspiration. Because sometimes the strongest walls aren't built of bricks. They're built of love, sacrifice, and the determination to never, ever give up. If Reginald's fight for justice inspired you, don't let his story end here. Hit like, share this video with someone who needs hope, and subscribe so we can keep bringing you powerful stories that the world needs to hear.